Hi, I'm Colby.
And I'm Daniel.
And we're both huge Armchair Expert fans. We've both been listening since 2019, since the first episodes. And I thought they were some of the most original podcasting and most original interviews. And when I started listening to them, it was just a really refreshing new way to listen to a lot of celebrities and a lot of actors. I thought Dax's experiences, both as an actor and both as an addict, were really interesting and eye-opening and kind of a new perspective and way to see the world.
I appreciated his long-form content with big-time Hollywood creators that wasn't about just promoting, the newest movie, but just was, talking about their life experience. People who were his friends. Mm-hmm. So I really appreciated seeing that.
Yeah, I think that he did a really good job of being vulnerable himself, and so that kind of helped open up guests to being vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that style worked really, really well. And so now, several years on, I feel like there's a few problems that have accumulated over the course of the show. And they're not all exactly Dax and Monica's fault. Some of them are just kind of how other things have changed. And some of them aren't necessarily bad in the way that it's some sort of intentional thing. It's just kind of things that I've noticed that have affected the show.
Right.
To start with, Dax's personality is kind of the engine of the show in a lot of ways. And his stories and kind of his telling different things that happened to him while growing up or while trying to make it in Hollywood are really interesting and exciting. Mm-hmm. However, it's a large amount of stories, but it's a finite number of stories. And so I feel like at this point, several years on, he's told most of his juiciest, exciting stories, and he's told his most vulnerable stories. And so he's still obviously creating new stories, but I feel like the rate of new things is slowing down. And that's not, there's no way you can avoid that happening, but I think that is kind of a fact of the show. If it's very personality driven, that is kind of a risk of the show when you kind of run out on some of the different stories.
They also just produce a lot of content. So even though, yes, he has new life experiences and stuff, he doesn't have enough to fill 4 episodes each week.
Yeah.
Worth of, funny and interesting stories.
Yeah.
Combined with the fact that his life is, for the better, has sort of become a bit more, has a family and he has sort of an established career now. It's not quite as fun as some of his crazy younger days stories.
Yeah. And same thing with Monica. I think that it kind of took a little bit longer for her to start sharing stories, but at this point, we've kind of listened to most of her stories as well. The next issue is pretty related. I think one thing that worked particularly well with Dax's show is that he would bring on a lot of his friends and people that he knew, either he worked with, and so he'd have a personal connection. But the problem with that is that that's also a finite supply of those people. And so I feel like at this point, he's already had on a lot of his closest friends and a lot of people that he's worked with. And so at this point, it's more people he doesn't know. And there's not necessarily a guaranteed connection in the way that when he had his friends on the earlier show. Also, it's difficult to sometimes bring back the same people. We've listened to him and Kristen Bell so many times. It's not necessarily that interesting when she comes back on again.
Also, as we briefly touched on earlier, at the beginning, people weren't coming on because they wanted to promote something necessarily. They were coming on kind of as a personal favor to Dax Shepard. But now his show is so big that it'd be a huge missed opportunity not to promote something. So everybody, even the friends now, have something that they're trying to shill.
Yeah.
Because it's such a big audience.
Right. I would say that that's point number 3, is that the podcasting industry has changed pretty dramatically since he started. I think at the beginning, since it wasn't really a given that many people would even listen to an episode, people were more willing to be vulnerable because it kind of felt like a closer room, versus now people are aware that the audience is quite huge for Armchair Experts. So people maybe are not necessarily as open to being vulnerable on the show. That's not something really Dax can control. It's just that the podcasting industry has changed.
And I do want to give him some credit. I think that he has caused some of that change. I think he's kind of reinvented the podcast as the new late night show in a certain way.
Oh, definitely. Part of the reason the podcasting industry has changed is because of the success of Armchair Expert, though. And they've really kind of crafted a show that kind of combines this long form podcasting as well as the late night media circuit. And I think that combination has allowed it to be really mainstream in a lot of ways, that in the ways that other successful podcasting like Mark Maron or Joe Rogan are successful and popular, but they're not exactly mainstream. They're not something that everyone is going to go on. It's a lot of times their buddies or particularly people that they like gel with. And so I think that Armchair Expert in particular has kind of led to all these other actors, especially doing their own podcast.
And to jump off that point, what you said about a circuit, I think is really true.
Yeah.
At this point, podcasting is so big you can't ignore it. Mm-hmm. So in a way that, like, if you used to, is in your contract, you have to go, if you do a movie, you don't just do the movie, you have to also promote it on all these shows. Well, you're not just promoting it on TV shows now you're promoting it on podcasts, which means that you get a lot of people who maybe don't want to be there, or at least maybe are kind of half-hearted in the way that everyone at the beginning was there because they wanted to be there. Now you've got people who you get the impression are there contractually. Yeah. As well as a related problem, media training has kind of caught up to podcasts. So in the way that people used to, have training to how to say nothing for 5 minutes and just sort of appear pleasant, now they can do that for an hour.
Yeah, people can be pleasant for an hour, right?
And this was inevitable. There's not really anything Armchair Expert could have done about this.
It's not fully their fault, though, either. Because it's a circuit, what are you going to say for, 10 different podcasts? You don't, have a bunch of different stories. And ultimately, you're trying to promote the movie. Whereas before, when people did a podcast, they weren't necessarily quite sure. They were, exciting to do it because they get to actually talk and explain themselves a bit longer. And it might have been one podcast out of a bunch of different small interviews. So the podcast felt more special, I think.
Right.
I think the other issue that has developed over the course of the show is the style of podcasting. Both Dax and Monica are trained in improvising. They like to talk about how they went to the Groundlings. And that experience is great and really helpful for their conversations. But it also means that they like to do little to no research. And so this has worked really well when it's their friends, somebody or somebody that they have common experiences with. Maybe they don't know personally, but then they find out that they have a similar or shared interest, and they can gel with that. Or especially if it's someone with a similar background to Dax, he usually loves them. Mm-hmm. But if it's someone with a very different experience, then sometimes the podcast can get kind of awkward, I feel like.
For instance, one time Armchair Expert had a scientist on, and Dax was trying to sort of pitch her on the idea that maybe you can't manifest something magically, but if you decide that you're going to think about it and you're going to want it, then it's going to influence your subconscious and you're going to just figure out a way to get it somehow. And she's being a scientist. It's well, I don't really know if there's any research on this, and I don't know exactly even how you would test that, so I don't really want to commit to that at all or anything.
Yeah.
And he kept trying, and it just didn't connect at all. And because he didn't have any sort of common background or common beliefs.
I think misses can be more common now since it's a media circuit, and that people that are just kind of promoting stuff have to go on there whether or not they want to be part of Dax's kind of system.
Right. For instance, a lot of guests don't particularly want to be psychoanalyzed, which is perfectly understandable. But if you don't want to be psychoanalyzed, that's going to be probably more of a miss.
Yeah, he loves talking about his background and connecting that with the guest's background. And so if the guest doesn't want to talk about their background that much, then it's difficult. Or even if the guest wants to talk about their background but doesn't want to jump to some sort of conclusion that they had this childhood experience and it led them to being an actor or whatever like that. Whereas Dax gets really excited about having a story and narrative, which I get, and it's fun and stuff. But not every guest wants to do that, and that's kind of the style of the show since they don't have research for asking kind of more detailed questions.
Right.
And a couple of times I feel the no research has been pretty bad. For example, the Tarantino episode, Monica hadn't even seen any of his films, which was just really, I guess, awkward to have such a talented person and to not really be able to engage with him on a deeper level. Fortunately, Dax had seen loads of his films, so he was able to kind of carry a lot of the conversation. But still, it's kind of awkward when one of them just doesn't really know anything about the person being interviewed. I feel there's been a number of gaffes where they just don't know kind of basic stuff about the guests.
Well, I think this is especially common with the experts on Expert.
Yeah.
Because fundamentally, they do have a sort of connection with all the movie stars and even musicians to some extent. But especially when scientists come on the show, it's often they often just have little understanding and little to say about.
Yeah. I think generally the experts on experts can often be not that great because number one, most of these experts are on other podcasts shilling their books somewhere else, and they're kind of saying the same thing in every podcast. And I think there's those better podcasts that'll ask more insightful questions on the topics that they're talking about.
Right.
Versus just Armchair Expert being another stop. And yeah, Armchair Expert really wants to get them to kind of commit to some sort of idea that Dax has thought of, but Dax has just kind of pulled it out of his ass on that episode.
Right. And so if you're an expert, you don't want to tie your reputation to Dax's random theory. Whereas if you're like a celebrity, sure, why not?
Yeah.
Like no one's judging you on that.
Yeah, exactly.
So once again, that's not. I think that's sort of just a fundamental flaw, a fundamental disconnect between their style of show and what the goal of this guest is. And
yeah,
I don't think that's necessarily like a fault of Dax and Monica.
Yeah,
it's just what their style is.
I think that point takes us to the next part, which is that some of the spin-offs work really well for their style and some don't work as well.
Because some of them are based much more on personality and some of them are trying to be based more on some sort of expert analysis or whatever it is. So like Shattered Glass or We Are Supported By, right? It's supposed to be like a feminist show interviewing like feminists and people who have done important work for feminism, but that doesn't really work when you haven't done any preparation for the podcast, because it just means that it's like sort of an uninformed person is hearing like the Wikipedia page of like Malala. It's not like,
that one was particularly disappointing. I felt like it would have been better if they just let the guests just talk and kind of give like a brief little seminar rather than having Monica and Kristen try to get like validation by this expert that their concepts on feminism are correct just because they are women. And so it was really awkward, that particular series. And then also just having Kim Kardashian on there with these other experts kind of felt very jarring, and like they didn't fully get the concept. Plus like not really appreciating this other podcast that also had the same name, and just kind of like not really listening to what these other people had to say. Felt kind of in bad taste. But ultimately the issue with the show is that they weren't really that knowledgeable in this area, and they also weren't particularly well researched on each individual guest.
So that one was a bit more of a flop because it was very content based, or it was supposed to be. Whereas something like Race to 270 was kind of like Dax and his best friends, and they were doing a competition, but the competition wasn't really the center. It was more that he had this like charismatic and interesting.
Yeah, I thought that one was awesome, and like I think it would have been awesome without the competition. Like the competition kind of provided a reason for them to call every week, but I didn't really care about them losing weight or gaining weight. It was just that Dax was having a great time with Aaron Weekly, and Aaron Weekly was really funny and had loads of stories himself. And so like it was just kind of that dynamic and them talking about their lives. And like, which was really interesting, just telling stories about them like getting together and like jokes and stuff. And like that was really funny and entertaining. And it wasn't really any like sort of heavy content or anything like that. And honestly, I feel like they should bring Aaron back for more shows. And I'm not quite sure what his role is, but I think they should definitely do another show together. I think that's really a kind of a missed opportunity, not having him kind of co-host something. I'm not quite sure what the role would be, but I think his personality really works well with Dax, because they're best friends. And
no, for sure. So I think you have that. I think Monica and Jess Love Boys had some. I think good
similarly,
moments.
like it was like fun to have that dynamic with Jess and Monica, and kind of also nice to have Monica not necessarily with Dax all the time, because Dax can be kind of he can occupy the entire conversation. And so I felt like Jess was more of a partner in the conversation.
Right.
And again, a lot of it, I enjoyed just kind of their conversations and talking about like their lives rather than necessarily it being that these challenges were super important. I think the challenges helped provide like a structure, but I think that Monica and Jess could have something again that doesn't necessarily need to be their dating lives, but...
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it was, because it was mostly just based around these people, then it was better.
Yeah.
So then you got some middling ones, like Flightless Bird is kind of between. It's kind of like, here's a funny New Zealand guy. He's got kind of a funny perspective. And it's also partly like, I'm going to deep dive into American, like strange American things.
No.
But it's not that deep of a dive.
That's exactly the issue. They can't fully decide. Are they going to just go for humor, or are they going to go for like actually like facts? Because I feel like sometimes they just want to focus on maybe the more absurd side of whatever they're investigating. And so I don't really think it's really that good of an analysis on American culture.
Right. So I think like one of their better episodes was they're talking about like Disney adults and like how weird it is that some adults are like obsessed with Disney. And it was just kind of them like shooting the shit, talking about Disney adults. Like it wasn't really like they didn't do like a study about this or like, oh, does this have some sort of connection to childhood development or something? It was just kind of their opinions on that.
And it was also primarily just based on a couple interviews that he did, rather than like he wasn't doing deep analysis. And so compared to his other episode about the dog show or cat show, I don't think that one was very good at all, because they didn't even bother to go to a dog show. They're like, this is all about dogs. And then it's like, well, we couldn't find a dog show, so we just went to a cat show. Then why call your episode dog show?
Right.
Why not either just do animal shows in general, or just wait and do a dog show later? Like, I feel like they don't need to have such a pressing release date that they just need to entirely switch what they're investigating. And not that cat shows are that different, but just that, like, are you doing an analysis on this, or is it just kind of like a silly type of thing?
Right.
I feel like the Armchair and Dangerous is kind of similar. They not really doing a full deep dive about it, and they're kind of just shooting their own thoughts about it, rather than any sort of thing that's based in fact.
Which isn't necessarily bad. I just almost wish they would go more into, just make it more personal. Just make it like, oh, it's just some friends hanging out. And we loosely have this idea that we're going to talk about a conspiracy.
And then finally, their latest spinoff, Armchair Anonymous. I think this is their best one yet, and I think it really plays to the strengths of both of the hosts.
Yeah, no, I think this is a harken back to the early days.
And a harken back to the days of like radio and stuff, and just having guests phone in.
The format of Armchair Anonymous is really plays to the strengths of Dax and Monica, because instead of having 1 hour long conversation, they've got like 3 or 4, 10 to 20 minute long conversations. Mm-hmm. And they have kind of usually a juicy prompt, like a time you betrayed somebody.
Yeah.
And then they get this great story, about different people and how they had, elicit like how they would like fall in love, in Italy and something like that, which is just a fun story.
Yeah.
But then this gives Dax, instead of one opportunity to psychoanalyze, this gives them like 3 or 4. So it's great. It's really fun. They're able to keep it lighthearted. All of the guests are fans of the show. Yeah, so everyone really, really wants to be there. You absolutely, and they don't have anything to promote.
Right, they don't have anything to promote. It's just kind of like the joy of like being there, which is a lot more enjoyable to listen to, I think.
Right. So in a way, and this is where I think the show is really impressive. They're kind of reinventing. They're reinventing the podcast again. They are bringing old school radio and almost sort of like Dear Annie columns about like people like doing little confessions of things that they either kind of like embarrassed or just haven't told anybody.
I think it works better than even like when Conan O'Brien on his podcast interviews some of his audience members, because there's this kind of like this prompt that kind of schedules the conversation in a certain way, rather than just kind of conversing with the guest. And I think
the other thing that you don't necessarily see, but I assume is happening, is they can edit. So it's not like radio because it's not live.
Yeah.
So I think if they have a story that is just boring, they just can cut it, and this person's a fan, so that it's not like you can't do that with a celebrity.
Right.
You can't just say, "Oh, your episode was good enough."
Right.
Whereas they can select to only have like the good stories on here.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think in some ways this is almost like a great, like a big revival for the show. This is, I think that for me, I find the Armchair Anonymous the most interesting and the most exciting of the new stuff that they can produce, and I hope they go more in that direction. To be honest, because I think if Dax had been born in the 1940s, I think he would have been a great like radio host. I think he would have been one of the all-time stars. So I think this is really. They're really well suited for this, and I hope they do more.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to how they continue to develop the show, and I wish them all the best. Anyway, thanks for watching.
Yeah, thanks for watching.
Bye.